Okay, so you want to run a Ponzi scheme. Not a small one, a real one, the kind that ropes in doctors, retirees, and entire charitable foundations. The kind whose name eventually becomes a synonym for the crime itself. You picture the private jet, the beach house in Palm Beach, the assistant who says, "Yes, sir," before you've even finished the sentence. You picture a room full of grateful investors thanking you personally for the 15% you promised them last quarter. Here's the problem. It is not simple, and it was never actually about investing at all. The paradox sitting at the center of this business is brutal. The better you are at raising money, the faster the whole thing collapses under its own weight. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why every single one of these schemes, without exception, ends the same way. A knock at the door, a sealed office, and a room of people discovering their retirement was a folder of fabricated paper. Let's start with what you think you're buying into. You assume the hard part is inventing a strategy nobody else has thought of. It isn't. The entry cost of a Ponzi scheme is almost embarrassingly low. You don't need a trading floor. You don't need a single real asset anywhere in the building. In 1920, a 38-year-old immigrant named Charles Ponzi started the entire genre out of a rented office in Boston with little more than a stack of paperwork and a claim about international postal reply coupons that nobody in the room understood, and, crucially, nobody bothered to check. That's the entire barrier to entry. A plausible-sounding asset class, a believable rate of return, and exactly one investor willing to go first. Everything else is theater. You need a nice office because trust is mostly a set design. You need a few early payouts because nothing sells faster than word of mouth from someone who already got paid. And you need one number, a promised rate of return high enough to be exciting, but not so high that it triggers the one question everyone in the room should be asking, which is simply, how exactly? Ponzi schemes almost never target strangers first because strangers ask more questions. They target a community already bound together by trust, a church congregation, a country club, an immigrant community that shares a language and a lawyer. Bernie Madoff built his entire early investor base inside Jewish country clubs and charitable circles in Florida and New York, a technique investigators later labeled affinity fraud because the fraud rides on social trust instead of financial due diligence. Once a respected member of the community invests and gets paid, their friends stop asking, "How does this work?" and start asking, "How do I get in?" That's the actual product being sold in the early stage, not a return, but access. The feeling of being let into something exclusive that outsiders can't touch. It's the same reason so many of these schemes recruit through churches, veteran associations, and ethnic community organizations, groups where questioning a trusted member publicly can feel like a social betrayal. Here is the mechanism, and it is the single most important number in this entire video. A Ponzi scheme does not generate returns. It redistributes principal. Every dollar paid out to an old investor as profit is actually a dollar taken directly from a newer investor's deposit. That means the scheme's survival depends entirely on one variable: new money arriving faster than old money is asked to leave. Ponzi promised his investors 50% in 45 days. Run that promise forward, and the math turns vicious almost immediately. To keep paying that rate, you don't need modest, steady growth. You need your investor base to roughly double every couple of months, forever, in a world with a finite number of people who trust you and a finite amount of money on the planet. Picture the arithmetic in real numbers for a moment. If a scheme owes its investors 10% a month and starts with $1 million under management, it needs $100,000 in fresh cash just to cover that single month's promised payout, assuming nobody asks for their principal back at all. Grow the base to $10 million, and the same 10% promise now requires $1 million a month in new deposits just to keep the lights on forever. With the number growing every single month, it survives. No legitimate investor base grows at that sustained rate indefinitely, which means the only question about a Ponzi scheme's ending was always when, never if. Within about 7 months, Ponzi had taken in somewhere around $15 million from more than 17,000 investors, and the machine was already unsustainable the day it opened. Because compounding payout obligations against a fixed population isn't a risk to manage, it's an expiration date stamped on day one that nobody in the room can see yet. Every operator who has run this playbook since has hit the identical wall. The scheme doesn't fail because the operator gets greedy, though they usually do. It fails because the arithmetic was broken before the first dollar ever came in the door. So why do these things ever get big at all instead of collapsing in the first month? Because redemptions are the real enemy, not regulators. As long as most investors choose to reinvest their profits instead of cashing out, the operator only needs enough new cash to cover the investors who do want their money back that particular month. That's a much smaller number than the total owed on paper, and it's the reason these schemes can survive for years instead of weeks. The moment that behavior flips, when a recession hits, when a rumor starts, when enough people want cash at once, the entire structure runs out of road within days. This is why timing a Ponzi scheme's collapse to any external event is almost a coincidence. The scheme was a corpse walking long before the crisis that appeared to kill it. The 2008 financial crisis didn't cause Bernie Madoff's collapse so much as it simply asked investors, all at once, for the exit door the scheme never actually had. A financial analyst named Harry Markopolos sent the Securities and Exchange Commission detailed, numbered warnings about Madoff's fund starting in the year 2000, nearly a decade before the collapse, mathematically demonstrating that the returns being reported were not possible under any real trading strategy. The regulator investigated multiple times and closed the file multiple times, partly because Madoff had spent decades building a reputation as a respected former chairman of a major stock exchange, and reputation in this business functions as a far stronger shield than any actual audit. Operators typically also control custody of the underlying assets themselves, sometimes through a tiny, obscure accounting firm with just a handful of employees who could never realistically audit billions of dollars in trades. Madoff's own auditor operated out of a strip mall office with a staff of 3 people, one of whom was semi-retired and living in Florida, signing off on a fund that supposedly moved tens of billions of dollars a year. That mismatch, an enormous fund and a tiny, unquestioning auditor, shows up in nearly every case on this list, because a real audit is the one thing every one of these schemes could never actually survive. This is a pattern across almost every major case in this genre. The fraud survives specifically because the person running it looks like the last person on earth who would need to run one. Let's put 6 of these on the ledger, one at a time, and read the actual numbers. Case 1, the man who lent the whole category his name. Charles Ponzi raised somewhere around $15 million in 1920 dollars, which is roughly $200 million today once you adjust for inflation. He was arrested that same year, pled guilty to federal mail fraud, and served 3.5 years in a federal penitentiary. He got out, immediately ran a Florida real estate fraud selling swampland by the acre, was arrested again, and served additional time on state charges. Ponzi, in his brief window of success, bought a mansion in Lexington, Massachusetts, complete with air conditioning and a heated pool, both rare luxuries in 1920, along with a fleet of chauffeured cars. Nearly all of it was seized or sold off within a year of his arrest, and by the time he boarded the ship back to Italy, he had almost nothing left of either the money or the mansion. He was deported to Italy in 1934, by his own account close to penniless. He died in 1949 in the charity ward of a hospital in Rio de Janeiro, with roughly $75 to his name, just enough, according to the men who buried him, to cover his own funeral. Case 2, the largest version anyone has ever run. Bernie Madoff operated his fraud for roughly 2 decades inside a firm most of Wall Street assumed was simply too boring and too consistent to be fake. His account statements, when investigators finally opened the books in December 2008, showed paper balances totaling around $65 billion that simply did not exist. The real cash losses, money investors actually wired in and never got back, came to somewhere around $17 to $20 billion. Madoff used investor money to buy a Manhattan penthouse, a Palm Beach mansion, and boats and vacations for extended family, none of it disclosed to a single client. He pled guilty in 2009 to 11 federal felony counts and was sentenced to 150 years in federal prison, effectively the maximum the judge could hand down. Courts ordered forfeiture of roughly $170 billion in assets and future claims, a number so large it functions more as a legal ceiling than a collectible sum. A trustee spent the next decade clawing back money from feeder funds and early winners, eventually recovering somewhere north of $14 billion for victims, an unusually high recovery rate for a fraud this size, and investigators recovered and sold his properties, boats, and a fleet of watches at federal auction, funneling proceeds back into that recovery fund. Madoff died in prison in 2021, having served about 12 years of his sentence. Case 3, the one that ran through a bank in the Caribbean instead of a hedge fund on Wall Street. Alan Stanford sold certificates of deposit through his Antigua-based bank, promising returns that consistently beat every legitimate CD on the market by several points, year after year, in a way no legitimate bank could actually sustain. Investigators eventually traced roughly $7 billion in investor funds, much of it funneled into undisclosed real estate, private loans to Stanford himself, and a lifestyle that included a cricket league he personally sponsored. Stanford spent investor money on a private fleet of aircraft, a cricket stadium in Antigua, and sponsorship of an entire international cricket tournament that carried his own name. He was convicted in 2012 on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. Asset recovery for Stanford's victims has been dramatically worse than Madoff's, with court-appointed receivers recovering only a small fraction, commonly cited at under 10% of what investors originally put in, and nearly everything he bought was later seized and liquidated for a fraction of its purchase price, since assets built for one very specific billionaire's taste rarely resell at anywhere near what he paid. Stanford is currently serving his sentence in a federal facility with a release date that, barring appeal, falls sometime after the year 2105. Case 4. The lawyer who ran his fraud out of his own law firm. Scott Rothstein, a Florida attorney, sold investors fabricated shares in confidential legal settlements that his firm supposedly represented. Settlements that existed only on paper he had printed himself. He raised roughly $1.2 billion over just a few years before the scheme collapsed in 2009. Rothstein bought a fleet of exotic cars, including several Ferraris and a Bugatti, along with a 177-foot yacht he named after his own initials. He fled briefly to Morocco, then returned and cooperated extensively with federal prosecutors, testifying against former associates. That cooperation reduced what could have been a life sentence down to 50 years in federal prison. Every one of those assets, the cars, the yacht, the waterfront mansion, appeared in a federal forfeiture auction within 2 years of his arrest, selling for a combined fraction of what Rothstein claimed his empire was worth. Case 5, the one dressed up as cryptocurrency instead of a hedge fund. Starting in 2014, a Bulgarian entrepreneur named Ruja Ignatova sold a supposed cryptocurrency called OneCoin that, unlike Bitcoin, had no actual blockchain verifying any of it, only a private database her own company controlled. Investigators and prosecutors estimate the scheme took in somewhere around $4 billion from investors across more than 100 countries before it collapsed. Ignatova disappeared. In October 2016, shortly before a sealed indictment named her, and has not been reliably located since, landing her on the FBI's 10 most wanted list with a reward of up to $5 million for information leading to her capture. Her co-founder was convicted in United States federal court in 2019 and later sentenced to 20 years in prison, while Ignatova herself has never faced a single day in a courtroom because she has never been caught. Case 6, the one that became a genuine national phenomenon instead of staying underground. In Russia in the early 1990s, a company called MMM, run by Sergei Mavrodi, sold shares directly to the public, promising monthly returns that at times exceeded 1,000% a year, advertised on national television as a legitimate investment. Estimates of how many people invested range up into the tens of millions. An almost unimaginable scale driven by aggressive advertising during a period of severe economic uncertainty after the collapse of the Soviet Union. When it collapsed in 1994, total losses were estimated in the billions of dollars, and Mavrodi was arrested, though he served only a short jail term before being released. And he simply relaunched nearly identical schemes multiple times over the following 2 decades under new names. He died in 2018, reportedly with a heart condition, having spent almost no time in custody relative to the scale of what he took from ordinary depositors. Some modern versions blend this model with multi-level marketing, paying not just returns but commissions to investors who recruit new investors directly, a structure regulators call a Ponzi MLM hybrid. Zeek Rewards, an American online rewards program, ran exactly this hybrid model and collected roughly $600 million from investors before regulators shut it down in 2012. Its founders settled with regulators, agreeing to pay millions in penalties and a permanent ban from operating investment programs of any kind, without facing the decades-long prison sentences seen in the pure Ponzi cases on this list. That's a pattern too. Hybrid schemes wrapped in the language of marketing sometimes draw civil penalties instead of the criminal sentences the classic version attracts, at least until the amounts involved get large enough that prosecutors can't ignore them. 6 different decades, 6 different disguises, postal coupons, a hedge fund, a Caribbean bank, a law firm's settlement drawer, a cryptocurrency database, and a state-sponsored share certificate, and the exact same ending every time. So let's actually add it all up, the way an accountant would, not the way the operator described it to his investors. Let's open the invoice. Charles Ponzi's take, roughly $15 million raised, adjusted to around $200 million today, against a sentence of 3.5 years, federal, additional state time, deportation, and death in a charity ward with roughly $75 to his name. Divide his actual retained wealth at time of death by the 29 years between his first office in Boston and his death in Rio, and Charles Ponzi's effective lifetime wage from the entire operation rounds to a number closer to what a single shift at a corner store pays today, and that's being generous. Bernie Madoff's take, somewhere around $17 to $20 billion in real cash losses inflicted on investors, against a 150-year sentence and roughly $170 billion in court-ordered forfeiture that will outlive everyone who was ever involved in the case. Divide the roughly 12 years he actually spent in a cell before he died by the nearly 20 years the fraud ran. And Madoff spent more time being punished for the scheme than most people spend building an honest career for an ending that still arrived in a prison medical ward. Alan Stanford's take, roughly $7 billion routed through a Caribbean bank against a 110-year sentence and a recovery rate for victims commonly cited under 10%, meaning almost none of that money will ever functionally exist again for the people who lost it. At 70-plus years old when sentenced, Stanford's 110 years functions as a life sentence with extra decades bolted on, for no reason except to make the math impossible to survive. Scott Rothstein's take, roughly $1.2 billion, raised on fabricated legal paperwork against a 50-year sentence reduced through cooperation, and a forfeiture list that included a yacht, a car collection, and a mansion that all changed hands at auction for a fraction of what he claimed they were worth. Even with his sentence reduced for testimony, Rothstein will be well into his 90s before any realistic release date, assuming full time served, which functionally erases the entire remainder of his working life. Ruja Ignatova's take, roughly $4 billion raised globally, against 0 days served, because the only sentence that can be handed down is the one nobody can enforce on a person who was never caught. And every year she stays missing is another year she cannot legally touch a bank account, a passport under her own name, or her own family without risking arrest. Sergei Mavrodi's take, billions in losses across an entire country, against what amounted to roughly 4.5 years actually served before his release, and a life spent relaunching the same fraud under new names until his death, which functions less like an invoice paid and more like a debt that Russian courts never fully collected. Now here are the invisible line items none of these operators mentioned to a single investor while the checks were still clearing. Legal defense costs across these cases ran into the tens of millions of dollars combined, money spent defending fortunes that were never real to begin with. None of the men who were actually caught can legally work in finance again in any capacity, for the rest of their lives, regardless of how many years they actually serve. Every relationship built during the years of success, the golf partners, the charity board seats, the family members who invested their own retirement, gets permanently and publicly rewritten as either accomplice or victim. And in several of these cases, a spouse, a sibling, or a close business partner also ended up facing civil judgments, criminal charges, or complete financial ruin entirely separate from the operator's own sentence. So calculate the real hourly wage, the number the operator never puts in a pitch deck, by taking whatever they personally spent or kept during the run, dividing it by every waking hour of the scheme's operation, plus every hour of the sentence that followed, and in nearly every one of these cases, that number lands somewhere between barely above zero and functionally negative once legal fees and forfeitures are counted against it. A retail cashier working minimum wage for the same number of hours would, in most of these cases, out-earn the man who supposedly built an empire once you finish the actual math instead of reading the headline number. The story sold to the very first investor in every one of these 6 cases was identical, exclusive access, an expert who's cracked something nobody else has, and steady, unglamorous-sounding returns specifically because wild returns would draw suspicion. The story that actually played out in every single case on this ledger was a redemption request the operator could not cover, followed by a confession, an arrest, or a plane ticket to somewhere the extradition treaties don't reach. There is no version of this business model with a quiet, comfortable retirement at the end of it, because the retirement was never funded by anything except tomorrow's new investor, and tomorrow eventually stops arriving. Fans of these stories tend to watch the lifestyle, the jet, the mansion, the yacht seized at auction. The people who actually ran these operations spent their final years watching something else entirely. The redemption line at the door, the balance sheet that never balanced, and the calendar counting down to the one day the new money finally didn't show up. That's the trick this business has always played on the people who run it. The same trick it played on Charles Ponzi in 1920 and on every operator who copied him for the next 100 years. It never paid a real wage at all. It paid a temporary illusion, financed entirely by the next person walking through the door and billed with interest to the person who built it. The frame on the wall was never a certificate of success. It was a receipt, and eventually every operator on this ledger had to read it in full, out loud, in a courtroom, with a room full of the people he lied to sitting there to hear it.